Nope, that was just resting membrane potential. What we were just discussing was what was happening when the neuron was not firing. And we introduced our first channels and pumps. A sodium leak channel, a potassium leak channel, and a sodium-potassium ATPase pump is the full proper name of the one we're referring to as Drake. The mechanical gradient of potassium ends up setting up a voltage gradient of about -70 millivolts. Ah, I hate this slide. It's always messed up for some reason. Let me get out of here real quick and fix it. These are my own slides.
Oh.
Yeah, I created these slides entirely on my own to explain a very, very difficult concept in a very piece-by-piece manner. So this is my lecture. It is in your textbook, and these details will all be in your textbook. It's not going to be phrased the same way that I phrase it. I hope that this is more accessible. That's my goal, is to make this more accessible and go step by step. I mentioned earlier that your axon hillock is going to summate. It's going to take all of the pluses and all of the minuses from all of the neurons that fired onto it before and send action potentials to their dendrites. It's going to take all those pluses and minuses, and it's going to summate them. Summation is going to impact our action potential. It's going to take us from our resting potential closer to, one more vocab word coming, threshold potential. Threshold potential is the voltage at which that neuron will fire action potentials. That's the threshold. If you have enough positive summations, we call them excitatory postsynaptic potentials. If you summate positively enough in a short enough period of time, you're going to make it to positive 55, which is our typical threshold potential. Sorry, negative 55, which is our standard threshold potential. If you don't make it that positive, an action potential will not fire. It is all or nothing. You either fire an action potential because you've summated enough positive inputs, or you do not fire an action potential because you did not reach threshold, which is positive 15 compared to 70, negative 70. If you get that summation, you get enough EPSPs, you make it to positive 15 millivolts, and you reach threshold potential, you will start your first stage of the action potential. We've got a couple of new channels. First is a voltage-gated sodium channel. And it's exactly what it sounds like. If the voltage increases enough, it's that positive 15 summation that we already saw. If we get that positive 15 summation, that's the voltage needed to open the gates of these sodium channels. And sodium is a positive ion. Sodium is a positive ion. If voltage-gated sodium channels open in response to that positive 15 millivolt summation, you will have an influx of sodium into the cell. It looks like that. So before, it was negative on the inside. Then you opened voltage-gated sodium channels, and positive ions flood in, down their gradients, into the cell, where they want to be. The effect of that positivity is to depolarize the membrane. You got to keep your positives and negatives straight here. Resting is at negative 70. At some point it's going to reach 0, and at some point it's going to reach positive 30. Going, it should be negative 55. Positive 15 compared to 70 is negative 55. So the process of going this way on this graph, we're going from negative to positive, we call that depolarizing. That's what depolarization is.
Negative to positive.
Going negative to positive. And you have to be careful with these numbers, because when you're dealing with negative numbers, when you're becoming more positive, you go negative 70, negative 60, negative 50, 40, 30, 20, negative 10, 0, and then positive 10, positive 20, positive 30.
What's happening at negative 30?
Nothing's happening at negative 30. At positive 30, that's our typical peak of the action potential. This stage, therefore, is called depolarization. Depolarization is caused by influx of sodium ions. Then the action potential peaks. And now that neuron has to get to the business of repolarizing. It's going to start returning to normal. It's going to do this by opening voltage-gated potassium channels. That voltage gate for it was about positive 30. It got to positive 30, so your potassium channels opened. And potassium starts to flood out of the cell.
Voltage-gated potassium?
Mm-hmm. So the K+, that's our chemical symbol, for potassium. A potassium ion is K+.
And for depolarizing, it's the sodium channel.
Correct. Depolarizing is due to sodium, voltage-gated sodium channels opening. Repolarization is going to be partially due to voltage-gated potassium channels opening. Those original channels and pumps, the sodium leak channel, the potassium leak channel, they're still there. They're still doing their thing. And Drake, our sodium-potassium ATPase pump, is still doing his thing. Still 3 sodium out, still 2 potassium in, still 1 ATP. Through the combined efforts of voltage-gated potassium channels opening, voltage-gated sodium channels closing at the peak of the action potential, and the continued work of the sodium-potassium ATPase pump and leak channels, we return to repolarization. And for a short time, we actually hyperpolarize. We actually go into an area where we are more polarized than resting potential. When you are hyperpolarized, it takes a lot more positive influx to reach threshold. That threshold stays at negative 55. But now you are even more negative than negative 70. You're at negative 80, negative 90 when you are hyperpolarized. So at this stage, it's difficult for another action potential to fire unless there's an extreme stimulus. Unless there are lots and lots of excitatory impulses. So here's a nice review slide for you. Threshold potential, negative 70 millivolts. You have leak channels, and you have Drake, sodium potassium ATPase pump, setting your resting potential to negative 70. At this time, potassium is the most permeant ion. If there is enough positive stimulus, we will reach threshold potential at negative 55. At that point, voltage-gated sodium channels open, And an influx of positive sodium ions causes depolarization of the membrane. At the peak of the action potential, sodium gates close and voltage-gated potassium channels open. So no more sodium can come in, but potassium can get out. The work of potassium leaving, combined with the ongoing action of the sodium-potassium pumps and leak channels, repolarizes and hyperpolarizes the membrane. Now we're a little bit too negative, and it's difficult for another action potential to fire at this stage. Technically, it is not impossible. Me and your textbook have a disagreement about the impossibility of action potentials at this stage. I'm right about it. You can have another action potential, it's just hard. Then slowly, as everything returns to normal, the voltage-gated potassium channels have closed, and our leak channels and Drake continue to work to set up our gradient all over again, so that once again we're at resting potential where potassium is most permeant, and leak channels and sodium and potassium ATPase pumps set up a mechanical gradient that it equalizes potassium but gives us a negative 70 millivolt change. I know it's a lot. I know. I'm aware. I'm not arguing. There's another slightly different variation on that same image for you. Here's the key to this action potential. You have your axon. This is a little bit easier point. You have your axon, and you have your myelin sheath, and you have these little exposed areas. These are known as nodes of Ranvier. I promised a lot of French people. There's a lot of French people. These are the sites at which the action potentials are taking place. Action potentials can only happen where there is no myelin sheath. So what happens is this part of the membrane experiences an action potential. It becomes depolarized and more positive. And that acts in a downstream direction. Depolarization here jumps through this whole insulated portion to the next node of Ranvier, and then this portion experiences depolarization and an action potential. And then it jumps to the next node of Ranvier. The positivity here opens voltage-gated sodium channels downstream here. And this becomes positive and experiences an action potential. So it is not that one axon experiences one action potential. It is that one, I'm going to go from this direction, that one axon sending information in this direction will have an action potential, which triggers an action potential, which triggers an action potential, which triggers an action potential, and when that reaches the end, the axon terminal, that causes the release of neurotransmitters. That's the purpose of this. This positivity gets all the way to the end of the axon, and that's going to initiate the cascade that makes your neurotransmitter undergo exocytosis into the cleft and causes communication with the target organ. If we didn't have this myelin sheath, instead of going like this, action potential, action potential, action potential, action potential, it would look like this. Action potential, 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 action potential. Which is faster?
The jump.
The jump. Yes. That's what we mean by the myelin sheath improves saltatory conduction. In other words, salt is not a mistake, sodium. Saltatory conduction. Salt's coming in at each stage. It goes faster when you have a myelin sheath. So if you have an unmyelinated neuron, if you have a demyelinating disease, one of the things that's going to happen first is slowing signals down. I know. You're frustrated. It's okay.
I just don't understand this. Okay, so in the normal cell, the sodium, potassium, they're there's 3 sodium going in and there are 2 potassium going out, right?
3 sodium out, 2 potassium in. We want sodium outside because that's what's going to flood in during the onset of the action potential. Sodium out if we're pumping it. Yeah, sodium goes out, and that is significant. I do want you to know 3 out, 3 sodium out, 2 potassium in, 1 ATP. That is important. It's on like every standardized medically oriented test I've ever seen. This Drake pump, the sodium potassium ATPase pump, we learn him here in neuro, and he's very important to how neuro works. He's actually everywhere. We're going to see him all over the place. And we're going to have drugs that act on him. We're going to have lots of things that are significant. We're going to have electrolyte disorders that affect this. We're going to have medications that impact every single channel we learn today. So there's a reason we make you learn it to this level. It's not me being arbitrary. It's not just saying, wow, neuroscience is so cool to me, so I'm going to shove it on you. It's saying, no, you're going to understand electrolyte imbalances later because of this. You're going to understand drugs later because of this. Yes? Demyelinating disorders?
Is that like ALS? Is that
Yep.
like the precursor?
ALS, MS are 2 examples of demyelinating disorders, yes. So in those demyelinating disorders, you ultimately do see damage to those neurons, in addition to destruction of the myelin sheath, yes. Good question. All right, any questions? That was it. That was your action potential. There's only 2 slides left after the action potential.
This is kind of a side thing, but is that why with MS you can't stress out a lot because it'll...
MS is autoimmune, at least as far as we know. So any stressful event that alters inflammation, and stress alters inflammation, is any inflammatory event is going to make your MS worse. Yeah. So we moderate. We don't want you to get sick if you've got MS. We don't want you to get injured if you've got MS. We don't want you to be stressed out if you've got MS. Those are all going to make your disease process go faster, and shorten your lifespan. Yeah, it's a bad one. And Colorado is an MS hotspot, so that's how it is. Yeah, we have everyone's got MS here. It is an MS hotspot. We have, I don't know what the actual number is, close to double the national average for MS
Don't
cases.
they come here because like your symptoms get like less here or something?
There are some old wives' tales related to health and altitude that really don't ring true for the most part. That's what National Jewish is here for. Do you guys know what National Jewish started out as? It's a famous respiratory hospital. Tuberculosis. It started as a tuberculosis clinic because we thought, okay, the cold, thin air is going to be good for your lungs. But really, if you've got compromised lung tissue, do you want low oxygen in the air?
you want to be at sea.
No, that was a mistake. So some of those old wives' tales did not ring true, but we got a world-class respiratory clinic out of the deal, so it's not all bad. So yeah, I don't see how the high altitude is going to help with MS. Unless something about the cold decreases inflammation. I don't think so. No. Let's go live in Alaska if you need that. So it's unfortunate. No, it's actually people who are born and raised here who are more likely to develop MS. And there are reasons, and I have hypotheses. Let's go into them in patho, though. Let's not crowd your brain with more stuff today. Any questions about the neuro stuff, action potentials? Any points of clarification? Do you want to walk through it one more time?
Yes.
Okay, walk through it one more time. Let's start at resting. We've got a mechanical gradient and we've got an electrical gradient. What ion is most permeant at rest? Potassium. Potassium is moving in and out, and when potassium's mechanical movement is in equilibrium, which means potassium is happiest. It's going in as much as it's going out. The electrical gradient is at what number? What's our? -70. Part of the thing that is allowing for movement of potassium is a leak channel. What's the other thing that's moving potassium? The pump. What's the pump? Sodium-potassium ATPase pump, which means how many sodium are being pumped out? 3 sodium out. How many potassium are being pumped in? 2. Good. And we have one more leak channel for the other ion that's involved here. It is the... We already did the potassium leak channel, sodium leak channel. All right, those are the guys acting at rest. And when it's in equilibrium, negative 70 millivolts inside of the cell. So the normal state inside of the cell is negative. The cell experiences summation. It gets enough positive input to reach positive 15 millivolts compared to negative 70. This puts us at what? What is this potential called?
Negative 55.
Negative 55, known as the threshold potential. Excellent. At threshold potential, if you make it there, it is all or nothing. If you make it, an action potential will fire. If you don't make it to negative 55, an action potential will not fire. Yes?
Are those the yes or no?
So we had a summation of yeses and nos at the axon hillock.
Okay.
And I'm just kind of simplifying what happens at the dendritic end.
Okay.
We have excitatory neurotransmitters and inhibitory neurotransmitters, and those actually do depolarize ahead of the axon hillock. I'm just kind of simplifying it. So after the axon hillock, we have enough of those positive inputs to make positive 15. So yes, the end result of those yeses and nos comes together to summate to positive 15. But that's where the yeses and nos end. Because once you get to threshold, it's no longer about the input of neurotransmitters. It is about action potentials propagating down an axon. The first stage of the actual action potential, once you get to threshold potential, what happens? Depolarization is going to happen because of what channel opening and what ion coming in?
NA channel opening.
Sodium. So what's the gate? What caused it to open? It's in the name. It's voltage-gated sodium channel. So the positive 15 millivolts is what opened it. And then there's an influx of sodium, which, as you said, depolarizes the membrane. At the peak of the action potential, we're going to reach approximately positive 30. So as you are depolarizing, we now say that sodium is the most permeant ion. At the peak of the action potential, sodium is what's determining that positive 30. It's a positive ion. Its influx into the cell made it more positive. So at the peak of the action potential, we need to start reversing this trend. So we close the voltage-gated sodium channels, and we open what?
Voltage-gated potassium channels.
Voltage-gated potassium channels, correct. Now, potassium is going to flood out of the cell. That flooding out of potassium, combined with the actions of leak channels and the sodium-potassium ATPase pump, causes this direction. What do we call this? Repolarization. And when it gets down here, it's even more negative than resting. Hyperpolarization. Is it easier or harder for an action potential to fire here? Harder. It is hyperpolarized. It is farther away from that threshold. In order to fire again, we need an extraordinary stimulus. Gradually, though, those leak channels do their jobs, and you return to negative 70, resting membrane potential. All right, you guys did better than you thought you would. You guys did great. So I'll do these last two slides. I'll stop recording. I'll make sure it's all uploaded, and then we'll have the rest of the day to review this, do the muscles, to do the superficial anatomy. We'll have plenty of time to keep talking about it. So. All right, neuronal pools. Honestly, I don't care about this concept too much. We've mentioned your dendritic spines on your dendrites. There's just insane amounts of attachments happening there, right? And then you can have only one axon output, but it can split, and it can innervate multiple axons or target organs, right? So you can have these different formations of circuits. You can have converging circuits, lots of voices telling one neuron what to do. You can have one neuron telling lots of other neurons what to do. You can have a reverberating circuit in which downstream neurons will actually affect the upstream neurons. and then parallel circuits where multiple neurons are telling multiple neurons what to do. So kind of like having a lot of middle managers and everybody's your boss at the same time, and it's kind of a bad situation. Yeah, again, it's not a bad situation in your brain. I don't think I have any application for you for this right now. It's just some vocab for the time being. This is on your worksheet. You do need to know this. You need to know, here's that pancake I keep drawing. You got a blue layer, you've got a red layer, and then you've got, usually we consider this a yellow layer. The blue layer is the most external, eventually. It's going to be your integumentary system and your nervous system. So this blue layer is the ectoderm. You have a thickened part of the ectoderm called the neural plate. And the cells of the neural plate are going to be called neuroectoderm, and they are going to, their destiny is to become your nervous system. That's all we're going to do with this. Literally, that's it. You need to know thickened ectoderm is called the neural plate. Cells of the neural plate are called neuroectoderm. Full stop. Yeah.
What does it become?
Your nervous system. Yep. And if you want, we can do more embryology. There's a lot more to it than that, obviously. These are the vocab words that are going to help you get that exam question. Any questions before I shut down my recorder?
What are the cells of neural plate are called
Ectoderm. Cells of the neural plate are called neuroectoderm. Any other questions? All right, thank you all so much.